She said he turned and looked at her as if it was the first time that he'd ever seen her.
Legendary FBI negotiator Chris Voss sits down with Jennifer Little-Fleck for one epic podcast episode. This is BrainCelling.
So I gotta be honest with you, you had me at amygdala. When I first read Never Split the Difference, I had just completed a brain-centric instructional design certification with my mentor, Dr. Kiran Umani. And he was the only person really that I had heard used that. And so when it was recommended to me to pick up Never Split the Difference, as soon as I saw that word in there, I was like, oh, where has this man been all my life? Of course. But, let's take it back a second to where you first started learning about this, because you talk about Amy Bondurant and
Right.
how, as she said, most people I tell this to, they don't go and do it, but you did. And that was to spend time on the suicide hotline. But I'm curious, my first question around that is, why did you, when most people don't, why did you listen to her?
It kind of just made sense. I mean, I always sort of boggled my mind that I was really the only one. No, I think a lot of us take advice. Maybe we stopped taking advice because most people we take advice from don't know what they're talking about, and we just decide that all advice is bad. And as I look back over it, there was maybe one time before that. That's kind of how I got into the FBI. I was told to go talk to this guy that was a veteran agent, and he gave me some advice that made no sense to me, but I followed it, and I got into the FBI. And so I don't know. It just, to me, it seems incredible that that's an unusual thing. It still does. She was a gatekeeper for what I wanted. And to me, it just sounds insanely stupid to go and ask and then not to follow it. Like a lot of people give you unsolicited advice. Free advice is usually worth what it costs, but it's really unsolicited advice that is worth what it costs. And to me, it just seems so freaking obvious that you should follow what people do. And I'm even trying to search my brain as to why I so take that for granted. I did an internship when I was in college with the Iowa Department of Public Safety, which was highway patrol and their fire marshals and their Division of Criminal Investigation. And, my job at the time was to go there and soak up, what they had to say. And so theoretically, they were putting me with people that I should be learning from. And I remember learning from them. This is the way I found the suicide hotline in the first place, when Amy told me to go look for it. Because when I was on that internship, I remember one investigator with the Division of Criminal Investigation. He said, here's your first investigative tool. It's called the phone book. Go there and look for information. You'll be surprised what you can find. And that's how I found the suicide hotline. But to me, it just seems so obvious to take advice from people that are in a position to give you advice. I'm still amazed by that to this day, and it is still so unusual. I don't know why. I don't know why for sure.
Yeah, it really is. But I thought another amazing thing, and I love dissecting the story because there's so many lessons to be learned from this single story that you told. The first time that you did it, you thought, hey, I got this. This guy is responding to me. It was somebody who was a frequent caller, and you thought you did a great job with him, and you went back and told your supervisor, and you were all proud of yourself.
Right.
And he was like, "You failed."
Yeah.
And so, what I find amazing about that story is that you said, "Let me do it again. I need to figure out why I failed." And I have a colleague who says, fail is first attempt in learning. And I just like to know from your perspective, how have you coached people to be okay failing at first?
That is an ongoing thing. And I think it is probably human beings' first dilemma, business's first dilemma, corporations' first dilemma. Like I was just given a coaching slash mentoring session to several people that work for me yesterday morning. It's that fear of failure is like the ass kicker, if you will. We don't get in education. It's almost a cliche to badmouth institutional education, just like it's a cliche to badmouth almost any of our institutions here in the U.S. these days. Principally because we have it so good, we have it so comfortable. We got to figure out something to badmouth, and we forget about the fact that we have the best systems in the world. I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent on that. There isn't another country in the world you want to get sick in. If somebody starts complaining about the FDA and big pharma, I'm like, you know what? Go get sick in England. Try that. See how happy you are. Because me and my company, we travel, and about a year or so ago, we were doing a training in England, and one of my colleagues got sick and needed to go to the emergency room. And since she wasn't dying, they wouldn't let her in. The way they do that, they prioritize it by how sick you are, not where you are in line. So you go get in line in the emergency room, you ain't dying. They don't treat you till you are. And I literally had to fly her back to the U.S. several days early so she could get treatment before she was dying.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so, yeah, all right. So the original question started off fear of failure being reinforced by our educational institutions. You get your butt kicked in school when you fail. There's no celebration of failure. And then even before that, around the dinner table in our families, by and large, we don't get socialization from our parents to embrace failure. You make a mistake, there's punishment. Rarely do your parents, they try to advise you on how you can avoid it the next time. One of my favorite stories, Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, her story is around the dinner table, mom and dad, or at least dad, probably both parents would go like, how did you fail today? And celebrated it as a learning thing. And that is so against the grain of everything else, from our families to our educational institutions. And then our amygdala kicks into high gear. If we fail, it's a negative thing. We're embarrassed. All these things that just reinforce this huge fear of failure. And so I'm mentoring guys on my team yesterday to try to get into, one view is Thomas Edison. I successfully figured out 10,000 times how the light bulb wouldn't work before I made it work. Or I love to quote the great Irish philosopher Colin McGregor, who said, I win or I learn. Like you have to take it on as an individual to override your fear of failure in you, and then try to give that reinforcement to the people around you as much as you possibly can. You don't want people to be stupid. You don't want them to fail to learn. To me, that's the real failure. You can make a mistake 3 times, but if you made it 5 times, you're not learning. That's the only sin is not to learn. But it's very, very hard to do it in yourself. It takes constant attention. And then you make the world a better place by trying to help other people work for you, with you work for. See it as a first attempt in learning. I love that. That's a journey along the way.
Yes, yes. And I'll give credit to that to a colleague of mine, Matthew. So with that, I've seen some companies now start to, when they do debriefings on new trainings, they'll ask people to, go out, try out these new methodologies, what we learned here in this workshop today, and come back and tell me how you failed and what didn't go right. So I think, to your point, failure, to embrace failure in learning, I think is really the key. Now, you also decided to learn why it matters to understand what is happening in the brain during the most tense type of conversation in the world. How is it that you decided to become interested in the actual neuroscience behind what was happening in the brain of these people that you were negotiating with?
Wow. I like what works. I like to figure out what works. Now that sounds obvious, but I knew I wanted to get into law enforcement. I never anticipated being a hostage negotiator. That sort of fell out of the sky. I wanted to be in SWAT. But since I wanted to be in law enforcement, I took what courses I could in college that I thought would be helpful. And at Iowa State University, they didn't have a lot of psychology, but I got to take what psychology there is. And I remember just thinking it was confusing. It didn't really supply me with answers because there's so many different types of psychology and they don't agree, all the different schools of thought. Like if you had a psychology convention, they wouldn't agree on anything. They'd all argue, which is an indicator of how difficult psychology was and remains without neuroscience.
Oh my gosh, I totally agree, Chris. You just said the magic word, psychology plus neuroscience. All right.
Yeah, there you go. You start combining those two. Now you got something interesting.
Exactly.
But the best analogy I could think of is it's trying to figure out what's going on in the brain without being able to see inside of it, which is what neuroscience does. It's like trying to figure out what's going on inside the next room with only being able to hear the conversation and not being able to see the actions. And there's a couple times very funny commercials on TV advertising stuff, where husband and a wife who got teenage kids, they're in the next room talking about something, or, they're in a closet moving stuff around and the kids are outside. They can't see what's going on in the closet. And to them, it sounds like mom and dad's having sex in a closet and they're disgusted. Mom and dad's just trying to move the cleaning fluid around or something like that.
Yeah.
You can't, you misinterpret what's going on if you can't see what's going on. And I think that's always been the struggle of psychology, pre-neuroscience. And you could almost discard psychology for what neuroscience has uncovered, but I think some of the insights from psychology layered in then become helpful to some degree. That I've seen some evidence of some really great studies about human behavior, and it was people that were both psychologists and neuroscience.
I was just going to say, I think one of those people for me has been Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's really been able to do those fMRI studies and then take what she understands about psychology and start explaining some things. You probably know who Chase Hughes is. I think he's kind of looking at that stuff too, just trying to understand, where we can marry up the two things to make communication better. So.
Well, you have a great curiosity about human beings, don't you?
Well, I do. Thank you for noticing. All right. So in everyone's life, we have these defining moments that change the trajectory of our career, our lives forever. I feel like that experience with Amy and going through that suicide hotline changed everything for you. And how do you think your life would be different if that had never happened?
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. I in a lot of ways, I probably would have continued to spin my wheels. Yeah, I was definitely, at that time, I was still, until I decided to go to hostage negotiation from SWAT. Yeah, it's a great question. If I would have ever discovered, I probably would have stayed in New York, working terrorism. At the time that I volunteered on a suicide hotline, I was, there was a small cadre of investigators on the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorist Task Force. And I was really drawn to the guys that made great cases. And it was the guys who were really good investigators and good at emotional intelligence at the same time. So I think and self-initiated, who would go out and, we didn't wait for cases to be dropped in our laps. we went out and found them. We went out and talked to people. We dug, and I probably would have just never left New York, I imagine, and stayed working terrorism, and who knows where that would have taken me. I could easily. In the early days, I thought after the FBI, maybe try to become a chief of police someplace. I might have stayed in law enforcement. It's an interesting question, but I was always drawn to people who made great cases, and I wanted to learn from them. And that's making great cases, about being curious, about having good emotional intelligence and applying it. So it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think you eventually would have got there because I just think it's in you. It's like in your soul. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you some other questions about some of the books that have come out recently. So in January, January 4th, we launched Empathy and Understanding in Business, and that was a collaborative book with myself and many other professionals, which I will hold up, right here.
There we are.
There
Yes,
we are. There we
awesome.
are.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to collaborate on that with you. Thank you.
And I guess I'm curious, what made you decide to start showcasing how other people were using your techniques and taking what they learned in Never Split the Difference and applying it in their own industries?
Well, it was Nick Nanton from DNA Films Celebrity Branding Agency. Nick put the project together, and Nick is a great implementer. He's a great marketer. He's very creative, and he implements great ideas. And he has the ability to pull stuff like this together. And the important thing for me is, every now and then, when some people, when they read Never Split the Difference, they're like, I was never a hostage negotiator. I don't think I can do that. You got to show me how regular people, everyday, successful entrepreneurs, help model this for me with someone that's a little bit more like me. And when Nick came to me with this, I thought, yeah, this is perfect. Because those that feel like, I can't do this, that's high stakes stuff, and you learn that in high stakes. It's just really helpful for other people to see that the world is full of innovative, creative, successful entrepreneurs that weren't hostage negotiators, but they're undaunted by the fact that they weren't, because they're very curious. And then when they stumble over this idea of empathy, it just resonates. And then they use it to, do great collaborations, actually, make the world a better place. Be very successful at the same time. I think the secondary goal is to make a lot of money. Primary goal is do a lot of good. There's three, do a lot of good, have a lot of fun, make a lot of money. But without the other two things, then making the money is empty.
Well, I totally agree. And what you said earlier, going back to a lot of people disparage the pharmaceutical sales world. I have to say, I know hundreds, if not thousands, of pharmaceutical sales reps, and I just have worked with so many great people. And these people really, honestly and truly feel like they are making a difference in patients' lives every single day. So when I wrote my book chapter, trying to help, give people a way to take what you do and really apply it, I have to tell you, Chris, people came up to me and said, I have been waiting for this kind of training for 25 years.
Wow. Yeah.
It's that powerful because they want to be empathetic and they want to have a real conversation with people. So, to me, it was a huge game changer, and it continues to be a game changer. I'm curious though, what's some of your favorite stories or a favorite story where somebody has taken, what you have to teach and applied it, if you can think of any?
Well, especially as we're talking about pharmaceutical sales, and I touched on that a little bit earlier because, If there's any stories in the media these days about anything, they're going to pick the small percentage to criticize because the media, for whatever reason, good news doesn't make money. And so you're going to see the bad mouthing of the pharmaceutical sales industry, and you're going to see this documentary on a sliver of the industry that was exploitive. And there's exploitive stuff everywhere. And so by and large, yes, I think we have the greatest medical healthcare system in the world. Overall, that's why I said try and get sick in another country. Now, yeah, you want to get certain types of surgeries, really advanced stuff. And there are selected pockets in the world that you will go to for a specific thing. But overall, this still remains the best place in the world to get sick, as it were. And that's because the vast majority of the people in it are trying to help. And pharmaceutical salespeople, this is a mission. A challenge of a pharmaceutical salesperson, I think, is frequently they know more about the medicines than the doctors they're selling to do. Because the doctor's got so much to keep up with. And if you're in sales and you have a product, you've had the opportunity to do a really deep dive on something and actually know more about it than the doctor or the hospital, which then makes it harder to make the sale in some ways because the doctor doesn't want to admit ignorance. They're supposed to know everything. And so that's where empathy really comes in. And one young lady that was in my class at Georgetown, she's trying to sell a doctor on a product, and she knew it would help. And he's not listening. And I'm sure it was because an insecurity of the possibility that on this thing she knew more, she was smarter than he was. And that's a hard thing for an advanced professional to admit, that ignorance, insecurity. So, and he's not giving her the time of day. And she started to take a look at it from his perspective, and she said, your patients are more than just patients to you; they're people, and you feel responsible for their lives. And so you're not just going to take some medication that some pharmaceutical sales rep has got, which is their latest, hottest thing, their most profitable thing that they're being trained to push on you because it makes the most money for their employer. You're not going to accept that because your patients are too important to you. They're people. Now, that's empathy. It's how's the other side see it. It's not selling. It's not explaining in any way, shape, or form. She knew she had a product that was going to help these people. She didn't bother saying that. His perspective, what was going through his mind, not addressing his insecurities, but his emotional drivers for what he's doing for a living. She said he turned and looked at her as if it was the first time that he'd ever seen her, and uttered the magic words, "That's right."
That's right. Wow.
And she ends up making a sale. And I always loved that story because, as what you're talking about in the sales industry, pharmaceutical sales, that's not the sales approach they're taught.
Until now.
Until now.
Real quick. If this is hitting home, you're not here by accident. People like us, we don't just consume, we back what matters. So if this kind of content speaks your language, go ahead and hit like or subscribe right now. It's how we keep building this together. It tells me to keep going. All right, let's get back to it. And Chris, that was a really powerful story. And I know with a lot of people that work with me now, what I actually do is I have them create an empathy matrix. What potentially is that physician thinking, but not saying out loud? So that when we get in front of them, we have in mind some of these things to be able to say, just like you did just now in that story. So that was literally the perfect story that you shared. That was awesome. So you not only have you done empathy and understanding in business, but you've also done, I believe, a leadership book as well. I'm I'm curious, what has surprised you the most about doing these different collaborative books?
Um, that hate to say being surprised by it, but there's so many people that are hungry for it. And when you stumble over empathy, tactical empathy, however you want to call it, how we're using it, what I'm not surprised, but I'm a little frustrated by, it's really hard for the beginner, mostly. And unless, for whatever reason, you've been working on your emotional intelligence for a really long time. And, there's this nagging feeling in you that there's a better way to do it. And most sales training, most success stories out there, most of the stuff that we see being held up in the media or movies and TV is, fake empathy. It's not empathy. And there's very little modeling that you can see. And so if you're new to emotional intelligence, you just don't get it. But so many experienced salespeople, entrepreneurs, leaders, when they stumble over Never Split the Difference, they're like, this fills in the blanks. I never really thought of Never Split the Difference as a sales book. And it's done ridiculously well in the sales world.
It has.
Usually with people who've read a bunch of other sales books and been frustrated because the magic that was promised in the first chapter never appeared, never materialized. But they felt that, there was something there. So I'm dismayed that so many people that are new to emotional intelligence's approaches don't get it. And then I can reassured when somebody like you, who's been doing it for a while and coachable, you take coaching, you like to read, you learn from other people. And so you've been at it for a couple of years, and then you hit Never Split the Difference, or you pick up, you pick it up in some other ways, in little bits and pieces in other books. And then bang, it all comes together. You're like, yeah, this is it. These are the answers I've been waiting for.
Yeah, and I saw that with sales and Never Split the Difference. But as it evolved into taking this to the level of leadership, Chris, I think it shined a light on how disturbingly bad most leadership is.
Yeah.
And way back in the day, when I was actually in sales, I had a new manager. And this, it was replacing a manager that I absolutely loved. And she got promoted, and we got this young guy in who had never led a team before. And we had a big sales meeting coming up, and we were all going to meet at for the first time at this big sales meeting. And you know what, Chris? He called every single person on our team to introduce themselves and to get to know them before the big national sales meeting, except me. And
Wow.
I just remember feeling immediately dejected. From that moment on, I had made up my mind without ever speaking to this person that I was never going to like him, and this was just going to be a disaster. And it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. I will say he was fired within a year. That's the kind of leadership that a lot of people are bringing to the table. They just don't get that when you're in a leadership position, it's all about the other person and how you make them feel. When I started reading your materials, I finally understood why I felt that way. It was a big epiphany for me.
And what was behind it? What do you think caused you to feel that way?
I felt like he was just in it for the promotion, and that anything that he was ever going to say to me was about that promotion, and it wasn't truly about managing my personal development.
Completely transactional, completely at your expense.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I think the leadership part of this, of what you're doing is so critical.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you know, I don't know how we can see the cover behind me on the shelf. Ego, Authority, Failure. Derek Gone on my team did an entire book on the deep dive of using tactical empathy in leadership. Interviewed a bunch of leaders. Derek was a commander of a couple different hostage negotiation teams. He's a brilliant coach. And I think it's one of the many areas it's great for us to continue to dive into and find out about. And yeah, lift others up, have it feel not transactional. And it's amazing the little things like that that just last in a very negative way, an inadvertent or, you know, a slight is so easy to damage somebody in all our relationships, and it lasts. Yeah, so understanding how innocently, and who knows? You know, he could have been intimidated by you. He could have been a misogynist. You know, there are equally large numbers of stupid reasons why he didn't call you or talk to you. And then have thought nothing of it and have no idea what kind of lasting damage that creates.
We'll never know. But I'll just say, for anybody out there listening that is a leader, I mean, don't ever do that. One of the things that I also wanted to bring up was that in the sales world, being able to think in the moment and not have a script, and you get more into this in the Tactical Empathy movie. I think having these techniques at your disposal is, when you have this cafeteria of techniques to pick from, it doesn't matter what situation that you're in.
Right.
But what's particularly interesting to me is the active listening component. You got to use active listening, but nobody told us how to do that until we came across Never Split the Difference. And to me, labeling, mirroring, there are all these active listening techniques, and that's really what you need. Could you talk a little bit about how that really is able to help you just be in the moment?
Yeah, it's great. And if you can get in the moment, it's so much more fun too. I mean, it makes it so much more satisfying. First of all, you want to get out of scripts, but you do want to get, I like to hear a couple examples to get people started. And that's really also where neuroscience starts to come into play, because neuroscience tells us that people are largely defensive, which is negative mindset. So how does that, your labels are making a verbal observation of a dynamic or an emotion. And if you're told in advance the negatives are the most impactful, then you start to look for it. It's a game where you're given a clue in advance what you're looking for, and with no penalties for wrong answers, as long as you're actually genuinely trying. So I'll say the label starts with, it seems like, it sounds like, it looks like, feels like, and then it seems like you dislike, and then we drill people to finish that sentence. So that kind of causes you to be in a moment, and people are really afraid right off the bat, and they're afraid of getting it wrong, or they're afraid of missing it, or being laughed at, or being embarrassed. But the brain is such an extraordinary quantum computer. I used to refer to it as a supercomputer. I'm not convinced it's a quantum computer. That if you just fire up the circuit, your brain will finish it for you. Now, that's really scary until you've tried it a couple of times with some zero stakes practice or some no stakes practice. And zero stakes would be like you're in a black swan training. You're in a live event that we're giving, but you're scared to get it wrong. Maybe this connects back to the conversation we had earlier about our educational institutions punishing failure and making them people afraid to get stuff wrong. But we drill it in the training, and then all of a sudden it's fun. it's kind of like this fun video game that forces you to be in a moment, to your point earlier. And then you discover stuff, and then you're delighted, and both sides have a more enjoyable interaction. You bond, and you get to a better outcome sooner.
It's almost kind of like playing volleyball. You know, when you're able to get the other side to give you a little bit back, and then you recognize it, and you can then ask them an even better question. What
Yeah,
we're
good
really
point.
looking
I love
for
it.
is that volley back and forth.
Yeah.
So here's my favorite question though about using these techniques is how do they help you spot bullshitters?
Yeah. All right. So there's bullshitters really bullshit three different ways. The three types of conflict types, which are fight, flight, make friends, assertive, analyst, accommodator. All right. So an assertive bullshitter is going to go on offense. It's what everybody talks about on gaslighting. If somehow you feel attacked, or if they're persecuting you or trying to claim that you victimized them in some way, they're going on offense with their words. That's an assertive's way of bullshitting, of covering up. An analysts, they look at it as a little bit more of an intellectual chess match. Analysts love deception by the literal truth, where, I may not have told you the truth, but at least I didn't lie. Like, get out of here.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, what does that mean? And what's an example of that? Company is auctioning off an asset, and they invite other companies to come in as bidders, and only one company comes in as a bidder. And there's a relationship between executives on both sides, and the bidding company goes to his buddy in the selling company and says, look, man, you got to tell me where we're at. I got to have some sort of feel, we're friends, we have a relationship. Just give me some idea where we are. And so the selling company executive says, well, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you you're the low bidder. Well, that's literally true, but they're the only bidder, so it's highly deceptive.
Right.
That's what an analyst does. I didn't lie. And that's an analyst bullshit, deception by the literal truth. Accommodators, they're the ones that want to baffle you with bullshit. And you'll ask them a question, and they'll give you a really long answer that you're confused by. Like, I don't even know what the hell you just said. That's someone who knows that a straight answer is going to reveal really bad things. Accommodators are very hope-focused, very relationship-focused, mostly hope. And relationships secondarily, because they're hoping things work out. But they will the ones that will baffle you with bullshit. And that's how an accommodator bullshits.
Okay, so in our last 10 minutes here, I would like to segue into the last part of the tactical empathy movie. You talk a lot about Brandon. Brandon's featured quite a bit in there, and I love how much you showcase him in there. You talk a lot about how, he grew up around it. He started watching you, picking it up. He was really kind of a natural. And I'm curious how you think that understanding empathy and neuroscience behind communication made you a better parent overall, because the other large group of people I see that could really benefit from better communication techniques are parents.
Yeah, one of the toughest jobs out there is being a parent. And I think if I did anything right as a parent, it didn't really have to do as much with understanding empathy. I think I taught my son to work hard. I taught him to be coachable. My parents drilled that into him. If ever, I never wanted there to be any doubt in my son's mind that I loved him, and I figure that from a parent standpoint, if if nothing else, your kids know you love them. That's kind of the best you could do because you're going to make a bunch of mistakes regardless. Now, he picked up empathy and negotiation by example. And I've actually been using this a lot when I'm talking to leaders. Because leaders have the parental dilemma. Your kids aren't going to do what you tell them to do. They're going to do what they see you do. And so leaders, if you want your people to be better communicators and better collaborative, be more collaborative with each other, you better not be a backstabber. You don't want them to play favorites. You better not play favorites. Because they're not going to do what you tell them to do. They're going to do what they see you do. And a company brings me in and wants me to talk to their people about the virtues of becoming a better negotiator, using tactical empathy, having better relationships. I'm now at the point where you and I need to talk about this in front of them, and you need to tell them about how you study negotiation. Because if you didn't study negotiation, why should they? You're not modeling it for them. And I realized just fairly recently that my son saw me using tactical empathy on a regular basis to navigate life. I never tried to teach it to him, ever. But he saw me modeling it his whole life, and he's very, very good at it. He's taken some of the stuff that we created and taken it even to another level. Like, he's ridiculously good at it. And, you know, he saw me really as a maverick in a government law enforcement agency, using empathy to get myself out of trouble on a regular basis. And then I turn around and he's using tactical empathy to get himself out of trouble in school. He was never getting any real trouble, you know, but the violations of the things that were just rules because they were rules. You know, there's two kind of law. There's stuff that's just wrong, and there's stuff that's wrong because society says it is, so that we can operate more effectively. Like, there's nothing morally wrong with running a stoplight. You know, that whatever your religion is, it didn't pick it up as a sin, saying like you're endangering your position in the afterlife by running a stoplight. But to make society running a stoplight's a bad idea. So when he was in school, you know, in a Catholic school that I put him in because the education was better, not because we were Catholic, you know, if he was violating the dress code that particular day, you know, he'd use tactical empathy to get himself out of trouble. So empathy is important to make you a better parent. Yes. What it really is to make you a better parent, actually listen to what your kids have to say. You know, every parent has a problem. I get one-word answers from my teenager. They come home, I say, "How was your day?" They say, "Fine." "What did you learn?" They say, "I don't remember." And then they move on. Well, you conditioned them to give you one-word answers because you didn't listen to the answers. You thought that being a parent was to ask those two questions to demonstrate that you cared. But when your kid, the first time you say, "How was your day?" and they say, "Oh, it's just picking on me," you didn't listen to the answer. You immediately launch into the advice that you always give them. "Well, I told you before, you know, the teachers are in charge, or it's this your responsibility, it's that responsibility." You guided them. You didn't listen to them. So why should they tell you about the rough part that they had in their day? Because you're not going to show them you listen. You're going to immediately launch into advice. Advice is not listening. And so to be a better parent, take the time. How do you actually listen? "How was your day?" The teacher doesn't like me." Well, it sounds like it was tough. That's listening, as opposed to launching into your advice as to what they were doing wrong, which is a parent you think caused the teacher not to like you, or the opposite, making them feel safe. "Well, I'm going to talk to your school. You know, you shouldn't get these sort of helicopter parenting. You know, don't dive in there and protect your kid from it. Actually listen. You know, it sounds like your day was frustrating. It sounds like this bothers you. You know, it sounds like it's interfering with how you enjoying your day." That's listening. So actually listen to your kids. There isn't that much feedback that we're given to actually listen to our kids. That's why they give us one-word answers.
I agree completely, which is why, in my chapter in empathy and understanding of business, I start out with a story with my then 10-year-old daughter using elicitation and accusation audits
Nice.
to get her to talk in the middle of a department store when she did not want to talk to me. You can't just be, how was your day? You have to be like, hey, I know that you have this really silly, goofy teacher, and I'm totally curious about what goofy thing did he do today in class. So, and I personally have found that when I am learning these techniques, and you do have to practice. You have to practice. But I find when we practice using our family, it sinks in so much, and like this magical thing happens, Chris. Not only are we learning these great communication techniques to use in our business, but our personal lives get better.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can definitely, have amazing conversations. Well, thank you so much for being on the program today. I really appreciate it. And is there anything that you would like to leave the audience that people would be interested in?
Yeah, subscribe to our newsletter. Go to the website, blackswanltd.com, BLACKSWAN LTD.com. You're gonna get asked to subscribe right away to the newsletter. The newsletter gives you concise, actionable negotiation tips, implementable, once a week on Tuesday mornings in an email. Plus announcements about what we're doing, where you can go to get some of the training. The live in-person training, there's a magic to 2 days of immersion that you will pick up more in 2 days of immersion than you will in 6 months of sporadic practice. You can definitely take yourself to the next level. And then the time after that is about skill maintenance. But you want to make a nice big jump, increasing your ability to accelerate all your relationships and your outcomes in a positive way. The live 2-day in-person training is really where you make the quantum leaps. And then the stuff in the interim is for staying at that high level. So, yeah, come to the 2-day training, but in the meantime, subscribe to our newsletter on the website.
Perfect. Wonderful. And I mentioned this earlier, for me, it's the immersion events. It's, getting in a room with a bunch of people who are going to hold you accountable for the next 8 hours, that makes all the difference in the world, and obviously being able to be coached by yourself. And you have a bunch of colleagues that also assist in the coaching. And I believe there's even different programs very specifically for women, aimed at, different things. So, I feel like there's different types of training for everyone, and to definitely, check out your newsletter and your offerings. So, well, thanks again, Chris.
Pleasure was mine, Jennifer. Thank you very much for having me in today.